Today's story is from a very old book. It's even older than I am. Oh my goodness. It's called The Golden Story Treasury. And one of my favorite stories in this book is called Genevieve Goes to Bed Early. It's written by Winifred Trask Lee. Genevieve Goes to Bed Early. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. Genevieve ought to go to bed earlier. That was what the doctor said when Mrs. Jones took her to see him, because Genevieve had not been looking well lately. She was not really sick, but her parents thought that her pink cheeks were turning pale, and her blue eyes were getting circles under them, and her nice straight yellow hair was growing straggly. And both Mr. and Mrs. Jones, of course, were so proud of Genevieve that they could not bear to have anything wrong with her looks. Genevieve did not mind a bit going to the doctor. In fact, she liked it, because after he finished poking her and looking down her throat, he always let her put on the stethoscope and listen to herself breathe. But this time, when he said that she ought to go to bed earlier than 8 o'clock, she started right in frowning. "I don't like to go to bed early," she said. "Don't like to go to bed early?" said the doctor, looking astonished. He was not really astonished, and Genevieve knew it, but he pretended he was, as grown-ups do. "Ah, but you must learn to like it," he said gaily, and then he gave Mrs. Jones a knowing smile. Mrs. Jones tried to smile back politely, but she looked worried. She could not imagine Genevieve learning to like to go to bed early. As for Genevieve, she was scowling like a terrible wolf. The doctor drew Genevieve toward him. "Genevieve," he said, "if you will go to bed an hour earlier every night for a month, I will give you a nice present." "What present?" said Genevieve. "Well," said the doctor, "how about a nice little doctor set in a little black bag with a stethoscope and everything, and then you can listen to yourself breathe all day if you want to." Genevieve stopped scowling. She looked thoughtful. "An hour earlier," she said. "Every night for a month," the doctor said. Genevieve looked at him, a long, slow look. If only he had known it, it was the look Genevieve always had when she was getting a good idea. She smiled sweetly. "All right, I'll do it." The doctor patted her on the head and said there was a good little girl, and Mrs. Jones, very relieved, put on Genevieve's hat and coat and took her home and gave her a nice early supper. Sure enough, that night Genevieve went upstairs an hour early and was all ready to pop into bed by 7 o'clock. Her parents kissed her good night and went downstairs feeling very proud. Mrs. Jones said she really thought that Genevieve was growing to be a very good girl. And Mr. Jones said yes, especially since he could remember how he had hated to go to bed when he was a boy, and what a time his parents had had with him, so that Genevieve's being so good about it proved that she was a very superior child. As for Genevieve, she was sound asleep and woke up at 7 the next morning feeling nice and rested. All day long she was very good. "Now you see how nice it is to go to bed early," said her mother. "It makes you feel happy all day." "Yes, Mother," said Genevieve. Mrs. Jones went into the kitchen to see about some chocolate pudding for supper. At 6 o'clock, the chocolate pudding was all ready. Mrs. Jones put some beautiful whipped cream on top of it. She was just setting it out with the rest of Genevieve's supper on the kitchen table when she heard Genevieve call from her room. Mrs. Jones went to the foot of the stairs. "What is it, dear?" she asked. "I'm all ready for bed," called Genevieve. "Come and kiss me good night." Mrs. Jones ran upstairs. "Genevieve, dear, it's only 6 o'clock. You don't have to go to bed until 7, you know." "I went to bed at 7 last night," said Genevieve. "So tonight my bedtime is 6. "But why?" asked Mrs. Jones. "An hour earlier every night," said Genevieve. "I promised the doctor." Mrs. Jones looked bewildered. "Oh, I don't think he meant it that way, dear. she said. "I'm almost sure he didn't." But Genevieve shut her eyes up tight and started to snore. Mrs. Jones did not feel up to arguing with Genevieve that night. She thought that it probably wouldn't hurt Genevieve to go to bed at 6 o'clock for once. So she opened the window and kissed her good night and went downstairs to put the supper away in the icebox and set about cooking some nice fried chicken for Mr. Jones. Of course, Genevieve, having gone to bed so early, woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Her family were still asleep, so she dressed herself quietly, went down to the icebox, found the chocolate pudding, and ate it for breakfast. Then she went out on the back stoop and sat down. No one was about except some birds who were hopping around and scolding each other about worms. Genevieve sat there in the early morning light, watching the birds until her family came down. All day long she played very sweetly. Mrs. Jones, watching her, decided that Genevieve had forgotten all about her idea of going to bed earlier and earlier every night. She did not even mention bedtime to Genevieve for fear of reminding her. Instead, she went into the kitchen and made a batch of cookies for Genevieve's supper and left the kitchen door open so that Genevieve, outside in the yard, could smell them baking. At 5 o'clock, the cookies were finished. Mrs. Jones took them out of the oven. She was just arranging some on a plate for Genevieve's supper when she heard Genevieve calling from her room. Mrs. Jones dropped the cookies and ran upstairs. There, sure enough, was Genevieve climbing into bed. "Genevieve, dear," cried Mrs. Jones, "nobody goes to bed at 5 o'clock, not even babies." "I do," said Genevieve. "But Genevieve—" "An hour earlier every day," said Genevieve. "I promised the doctor." So there was nothing for Mrs. Jones to do but to kiss Genevieve goodnight and open the window and go downstairs and put the cookies away. When Mr. Jones came home, she told him all about it. "Whatever shall I do?" she asked. Mr. Jones stroked his chin. "If she keeps going to bed earlier and earlier," he said, "and getting up earlier and earlier, she will soon be getting up in the dark with nothing to do and no one to play with, and then she won't like that a bit. Then she'll stop all this foolishness and act like a sensible child." Mrs. Jones said she certainly hoped so and decided not to worry. Well, the next morning, Genevieve woke up at 5 o'clock. She ate her supper for breakfast and went outside to watch the birds. It was just turning light, and the birds were not up yet. Genevieve had to wake them all up. "Hi, birds!" she cried, leaping around under the trees until they all came out of their nests and hopped about the ground rather groggily, looking for worms. That day, Genevieve went to bed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mrs. Jones did not say anything. She was sure that Genevieve would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and find that it was dark and that there was no one to play with. Surely Genevieve would at last decide to be sensible. But did she? Not Genevieve. She woke up at 4, of course, and ate her supper for breakfast and went outside to wake up the birds. But it was so dark outside that the birds would not wake up. They just stuck their heads over the edges of the nest and told her quite crossly to go away and not bother them anymore. Genevieve went back into the kitchen and sat down. She was lonely, but she wasn't going back to bed, not for just a little thing like loneliness. And she sat there very still. As she did, she heard a little squeaking sound in the wall over the kitchen sink. She sat perfectly still, listening, and in a moment, 2 little mice came out of a hole in the corner and climbed up on the sink and started eating the crumbs from Genevieve's supper. Genevieve smiled. "Hello, mice," she said. The startled mice scuttled for their hole, but Genevieve called out to them, "Oh, please don't go away. I will give you some lovely food from the icebox." The mice were surprised because people do not generally give them food on purpose. They waited suspiciously, ready to dart off at any moment, while Genevieve rummaged in the icebox. But when she placed on the floor a nice plate of food with cheese and bacon and everything that mice like best, and then went and stood far away from them, they stopped being frightened and ate it up cheerfully, squeaking all the while. When it grew light, they ran away. But Genevieve called after them to come back the next morning and bring some friends with them, and she would give them all a lovely feast. Then she ran outdoors herself, feeling very happy and thinking that the mice were really lots of fun. All day long she played very sweetly. until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Promptly at 3, she went to bed. When she got up at 3 the next morning and crept downstairs and switched on the kitchen light, she found the mice with a lot of their friends all waiting for her. She sat on the floor with the plate on her lap heaped high with her own supper and some cookies and bacon and butter from the icebox, and she let the mice eat it all up. They did not seem at all frightened today. They squeaked and chattered while they feasted. When they had finished, they chased each other merrily around the kitchen floor until it grew light, when they scuttled back into their hole again. After that, they came back every night. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, of course, could not imagine what Genevieve found to play with when she got up in the dark. They thought she would surely stop soon. But Genevieve kept right on going to bed earlier and earlier and getting up earlier and earlier. She went to bed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and she got up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then she went to bed at 1 o'clock, which is really dinner time. But Genevieve said she didn't want any dinner, thank you, and to just put it in the icebox. And she got up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and then she went to bed at noon, which is the very best part of the day. Only Genevieve didn't care. And that night she got up at midnight. But whatever time she got up, she had only to call the mice back, and they came, bringing more and more friends with them. Mrs. Jones began to notice that the house seemed to be very full of mice. "I don't understand it," she said. "I will set some traps," said Mr. Jones, and he did. That night, Genevieve came down at 11 o'clock. The mice were huddled in the middle of the kitchen floor. They looked at her crossly. Genevieve then saw the traps. She went and undid them. And then, because the mice still looked hurt, she went and found a beautiful chocolate cake which her mother had baked for Sunday and gave it all to the mice. Genevieve kept right on going to bed earlier and earlier and getting up earlier and earlier. Now she was going to bed in the morning and getting up in the night. She went to bed at 10 o'clock in the morning, got up at 10 at night, just when her parents were going to bed. Then she went to bed at 9 in the morning, and that night she had to wait for her parents to go to bed before she could call the mice. Of course, she never played outdoors anymore because she was only awake at night, and she did not have very much to eat because she was always asleep at dinner time, and the supper her mother put by for her she mostly gave to the mice. But Genevieve did not care. The mice were getting round and sleek and fat from all the food and had grown very friendly toward her. The day that she went to bed at 7 o'clock in the morning and got up at 7 in the evening, her father and mother were just sitting down to their dinner. They had not seen Genevieve lately because of her peculiar hours. When she came into the dining room, they looked at her in distress. "Why, she looks worse than ever," said Mrs. Jones. And it was true. Instead of growing fatter and stronger, Genevieve had grown paler and thinner. The circles under her blue eyes had grown larger and darker than ever. As for her nice sturdy legs, they were beginning to look like 2 pieces of spaghetti. Mr. Jones shook his head. "You'd better take her to the doctor again." So Mrs. Jones took Genevieve to see the doctor. The doctor was surprised to see Genevieve looking so pale and dreadful, as if she hadn't been to bed at all for a week. "You promised me," he said, "that you would go to bed early every night." "I do," said Genevieve. "Very early." "I can't believe it," he said, puzzled. "Well," said Genevieve, "tonight, for instance, I shall go to bed at 6 o'clock in the morning. Isn't that early?" "What?" said the doctor. So Mrs. Jones explained to the doctor how Genevieve had been going to bed an hour earlier, and then an hour earlier than that, and so on, until now she was up all night and asleep all day. "That is not what I meant at all," said the doctor. Mrs. Jones explained that she had not thought he meant it that way either, but Genevieve had insisted that she must keep it up for a month to earn her doctor's set. Said the doctor. Then he said, "Genevieve, I will give you the doctor's set now if you will stop all this foolishness and go to bed every night at 7 o'clock like a sensible child." "No," said Genevieve, "I like living at night." Then the doctor said, "I will even let you hear me breathe, Genevieve." "I'm not interested in breathing anymore," said Genevieve. "I'm only interested in mice." "Mice," said the doctor. So Genevieve told him all about the mice. As a matter of fact, he was very interested. But after thinking it over, he shook his head. "You will have to stop this just the same." "Why?" asked Genevieve. "Because I say so," said the doctor. People always have to do what the doctor says. Well, of course, Genevieve knew that this was true, so she had to give in, but the doctor gave her the set anyway, and it was all packed in a very nice little black bag, and Genevieve really meant it when she said, "Thank you." Genevieve went home carrying her present proudly and ate her supper and went to bed at 7 o'clock like a sensible child. But she was all the time thinking that when she grew up and could do what she liked, she would stay up all night and have all her friends be mice. I hope you enjoyed that story of Genevieve Goes to Bed Early.